Okay, so here we go. And so again, we're going to try to welcome everyone, and we're going to try to cover the remainder of the Second Temple era. Last week we talked about the role, the beginning of the Second Temple era, of this group called the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, the Men of the Great Assembly. We talked about who they were, what they did. We pointed out that the Men of the Great Assembly, it wasn't one group of people that met at one time in like some parliament and sat together and issued various proclamations, but rather what it was, and we're going to hopefully get back to this in a little bit more detail in just a little bit, but essentially throughout the generations, there's always been a Sanhedrin Hagadol, Beis Din Hagadol b'Yerushalayim. There's always been a central court that really functioned as the both legislative as well as judicial bodies of the Jewish people, and that existed from the Moshe, from the times of Moses, going all the way through, the First Temple era, and they enacted, they did whatever it is that they did. But we're taught at the beginning of the Second Temple era for about a period of, I don't know how many years, but probably a few decades, you had a particularly, I don't know if they were more significant than other. I mean, they were more significant in a historical sense, that they issued, they legislated a lot of what we're used to in Jewish life, at least in rabbinic Jewish life, really comes onto the scene. It gets concretized by this group during these few decades, or however long it is. These are the Men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, which were taught, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, had prophets on it. You had people like Mordechai and the like. And it says the last one of the Men of the Great Assembly of the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah was Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous. Now, I guess picking up from that point, when we talk about the Second Temple era, when we talk about the Bayis Sheni during the Second Temple era, and again, we talked about the years, the dating, we spent some time on that last week. Welcome. It's exactly what years we're talking about: the year 421 BC, the year 586 BC. It depends how you calculate, who you ask. But beginning in the Second Temple era, really the entirety of the Second Temple era is dominated with the Jews not being in control. Meaning, as opposed to the First Temple era, where you had the kingdom, you had the Malchus, you had Jews had autonomy either over all of Israel, or at least Judea, and the northern kingdoms being in charge over there. During the Second Temple era, the Jews are virtually always going to find themselves under the watchful eye of some world power. So even the beginning of the Bayis Sheni, the beginning of the Second Temple era, the Second Temple is built with the permission, blessing, even the financial backing of the Persians, as we talked about last week. Now, and that's when the Men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, that's when they're doing their thing. The Persians are defeated by Alexander the Great. The Persian dominant, world dominance, is going to be defeated by Alexander the Great in the year whatever year that was, 300 BC, 280, around then BC. And again, this whole time the Jews are semi-autonomous. We talked about oftentimes, for the most part, during the Second Temple era, unfortunately, and this wasn't really how things ought to have been, the power of the executive branch, the main executor of the Jewish people, was often the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and that's not how it's supposed to be. But that's how things were. And the Kohen Gadol, who's the high priest, it's really supposed to be a separate political. The whole kahuna, the priesthood, is supposed to be a separate political wing within Judaism. It ends up becoming much more of an executive branch as well. Now, after the Greeks, defeat the Persians. So it's the same kind of structure where instead of now Judea being and the Second Temple, the Jews being under the dominance of the Persians, they're now under the dominance of the Greeks. Now, initially, there's a story, the Gemara tells us in Yoma, the Gemara in Yoma says that Alexander the Great originally decided he wanted to destroy the temple. He wanted to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Gemara tells us that Shimon HaTzadik, this last person who served on this council, the men of the Great Assembly, he has an encounter with Alexander the Great, and he convinces him otherwise. And as a way of showing tribute appreciation, it became a Jewish tradition. I think it says that whole year, all baby boys that were born, they named them Alexander. So if you ever see, you'll take note, Alexander is a very Jewish name. It's not an uncommon, it's a very much a Jewish name. And according to what the Talmud says, that's the source. Eventually, Alexander, like everyone, dies. And if you study your Greek history, the Greek influence, Greece kind of finds itself convulsing in civil war of sorts between the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is down in Egypt, and the Seleucid dynasty, which is up north. And they would constantly be fighting really for the next many, many years. And what would happen is that they would constantly be fighting. Now, what's going to be between this, the Seleucids, which are mainly heavily based in Syria, the Ptolemaic dynasty is down in Egypt. Well, who's in between? Right, Israel. The truth of the matter, and there were, I think, if I recall, I think there were like 5 or 6 or 7 major battles between the years of something and something else. I don't remember, maybe between the year 285 and let's say 200 BC, something like that, 300, 200, they'd be fighting constantly. The truth of the matter is, for the most part, Israel was unmolested. The Jewish people were able to do their thing. The most fighting didn't interfere with mainly with Jewish life, at least in Jerusalem. It wasn't, the Jews were able to do their thing, with notable exceptions. Originally, for the first about 50 years or so, Jerusalem was dominated under the kind of the world power of the Ptolemaic dynasty down in Egypt. And it's during this time we're taught about an interesting event that took place. The Gemara in Megillah tells us that what happened was the Ptolemites were interested in understanding the Torah. They wanted to understand what the Torah, what's in this Jewish code of law. There are a lot of theories. Why were they so interested in the Torah? Was it because they wanted to be enlightened? Most likely, the reason why they were interested was because, again, Judea was semi-autonomous. They weren't really, as long as they paid tribute, as long as the Jewish people didn't rebel against the Egyptian Greeks, they were fine with the Jews doing their own thing, with the Jews having autonomy over their temple. The Jews were even given a pass. Normally, the Greeks would require you to put idols in their places of worship. The Jews were fiercely, monotheistic, and the Greeks were cool with that. They were fine. Like, okay, you know what? Fine. They gave the Jews an exception that they could run their temple how they wanted. But presumably, because of that autonomous nature, they probably wanted to get a sense, who are these people and what is their code of law? And it was because of that, the Greeks, again, down in Egypt, they asked, or they kind of required, that the Jews were to translate the Torah into Greek. And the Talmud tells us the story that they had 70 different sages locked up in different rooms, and they all were forced to translate it independently into Greek. And the Gemara tells us it was actually somewhat of a miraculous occurrence, because if you think about it, if you translate the Torah literally, you're gonna end up with a lot of confusion. So anytime you're translating something, it requires a certain element of wisdom and judgment. How are you going to translate it? What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? And they all made the same types of revisions, as it were, amendments to the text, so that in their translation, they could have translated it A or B. A being the more, I guess, faithful translation, but the incorrect interpretation. So they decided all to translate it B, which is maybe less in terms of fidelity to the actual translation of the word, but it's a lot more on board in terms of the understanding and interpretation of the verse. And all the sages made the same, several corrections. They all made the same choices. It was considered Maisam Nisim. It's considered a miraculous occurrence. Now, it's called the Tirgum Shivim, the translation of the 70 elders. The Talmud actually tells us this is considered one of I believe it's on Asara B'Teves, 10th month, 10th date of the Jewish month of Teves is a fast day. Jews, the tradition is we fast on Asara B'Teves. It's always easy. There are, I think, there are six fasts throughout the Jewish calendar. 4 of them mourn various elements of destruction. One is Yom Kippur, one is Tainus Esther, which is kind of off on its own island. But we have 4 fasts that commemorate tragedy and destruction on the Jewish calendar. One of them is Asara B'Teves, which is always the easiest fast because it's always the middle of December, and the fast is always from sunrise to sunset. So in the middle of December, it's always like, it's like 6:15 to 4:30, like not a big deal. Like that's always it's a gimme fast. But we're taught there are several reasons why we fast on Asara B'Teves, and one of them we're taught the reason why we fast is because it was on Asara B'Teves is when the Targum Shivim, that was the day that the Torah was translated into Greek. And I remember as a youngster, even when I was in yeshiva, I was always like, what? I mean, I guess it's not great that the Greeks got a hold of our Torah, but like, why is that so tragic? That it's literally marked on the calendar. It's one of the 5 tragic events that occurred on it. Our Talmud tells us there are other events that happened on Asara B'Teves. It's marking a couple other tragedies, but this is one of them. And like, what's so tragic about it? And I only realized this after much later in life is you pick up today a copy of the New Testament. Give yourself the good old King James Bible. Good old King James Bible. Now, good old King James, what did he translate the Bible from? So I always thought he looked at the Hebrew. He had some Hebrew scholars, which there were plenty of Hebrew scholars back then, and they translated it into English. That's not the case. They actually translated the King James edition of the Bible is a translation of close, the Vulgate. The Vulgate was the Latin translation of the Torah in the year whatever, I don't know. The Vulgate, what was that a translation of? So I always thought, okay, the Vulgate was a translation of the Hebrew. No, the Vulgate is a translation of the Targum Shivim, what's known as the Septuagint. This translation, the Septuagint that takes place in Ptolemaic, in the Egyptian Greeks at this time, this translation is ultimately what would be used for the New Testament and for the Christian world. So you want to know why is it considered not necessarily why it's considered a tragedy? Look, let's without offending any of my Christian friends, the overwhelming history of Jewish Christian relationships over the last 2,000 years has been essentially a horrific tale of horrors and calamity. So I'm assuming our sages, when they mark the Septuagint as a moment of tragedy, I think part of it is that like the Torah is something that's very unique and special to the Jewish people, and we don't want it being bastardized. But I think my gut tells me is that it probably represents a transition in world history from Judaism kind of being cloistered and its own little spot to now the Torah and the New Testament and Christianity, which for the most part, again, there are noble exceptions of heroic Christians who have been good to the Jews. But if we take the large, broad view of a sweep of history, the Jewish-Christian relationship has not been a particularly friendly one. There was a question.
Yeah. The Vulgate was Latin?
I believe, yeah.
Okay. And the King James version, King James got a bunch of scholars in this.
Yeah.
King James version, they translated from Latin
to English, from the Vulgate.
English.
Yeah, the English from the Latin, from the Greek, from the Hebrew. And I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all, so if I'm mistaken, I'm mistaken. But my understanding is you can even source one of the classic things when all these Jews for Jesus people, they look at all these, verses in the Old Testament to say, you see, it says in Deuteronomy, verse this, chapter this, verse that Jesus is going to come. And like, you ever look at the verse, like, what are you talking about? It doesn't say anything close to that. And you can see where the mistranslation came from. Sometimes it's because somewhere the Greek translates weird into the Latin, or the Latin translates strange into the English. It's like, some words can have multiple meanings and it's like kind of a broken game of telephone. Now, that's some of the time. Most of the time, it's deliberate misrepresentation of the verse because the Christian the church fathers deliberately want there to be references to Jesus in the Old Testament because it serves their purposes. So there's a clear bias there and a clear motivation, but that's for a different discussion. So, yeah.
So the King James Version was, the purpose was to make an English translation that common people, the very wealthy,
Right.
common people could read.
In the 1600s, yeah.
In the 1500s, the guy was executed for translating the Bible into English. We did that.
Oh, okay.
Because at that time, it was not permitted to translate.
Yeah, well, again, and I don't want to get too far off course, but well, I guess English. Not getting too deep into Christianity, I'm not an expert in Christianity. Typically, the Catholic Church did not want people reading the Bible. Interesting. They didn't. They wanted.
Even the New Testament?
Definitely the old, maybe certainly not the Old Testament, even to some degree the New Testament. They wanted to control the messaging. So they were not interested. It's like a weird thing, but they did not, still don't really love the accessibility for people but again, I'm not an expert. But again, that if you said it's in English, that's probably going to be after the Reformation. But I don't know the dates. By the year 250 ballpark, before the Common Era, the Seleucid dynasty takes over, maybe even earlier. Now, about the year 250, the Seleucid dynasty drive out the Egyptian Greeks from Israel, and they become the dominating force. Again, and this is an important point, the Jewish people are still living pretty semi-autonomously in Judea. They are able to do their things. They're able to observe their rituals and customs and practices and monotheistic beliefs in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple in Jerusalem, unmolested, as long as they're paying as long as they are recognizing that the Greeks are in control, things work. In the year ballpark, 165 of before the Common Era, that's when things change. It's not historically super clear why. Things were going pretty smoothly, but for some reason, the king at the time, Antiochus, I believe Antiochus III, doesn't like the Jewish autonomy and begins infiltrating, Judaism and Jewish practice and observance. And it's during this period where we have the Hanukkah story. It's not exactly super clear why Antiochus. There are different theories, historical theories. It's not super relevant, but for one reason or another, the Greek position of letting the Jews kind of do their thing changes. And they begin interfering with Jewish observance, Jewish ritual practice, religious practice, and they begin banning a lot of ritual observance. They, especially in the temple, we know, is defiled and basically the temple service comes out of use. The Jewish people are prohibited from practicing their Judaism, engaging in Torah scholarship, from things like bris milah, which are the circumcision, which is so central in Judaism, Shabbos observance, some of the major fundamental ideas of that sustain Jewish life. The Greeks decide they're going to clamp down on that, and they did. And many Jews go into hiding, and we know this is when the story of Hanukkah comes. The Jews go into hiding after 3 years or so, hiding in the caves in Modi'in or wherever they are. They begin a revolt, and the Jews revolt against the Greeks, led by Matisyahu, who is the Kohen Gadol. He was the high priest, who seems to have been a very righteous person. He has his 5 children go ahead and kind of organize and rally the Jewish people to rebel against the Greeks. And they're able to successfully battle the Greeks and drive them out of Jerusalem and Judea. And this is the story, we know the story of Hanukkah. They're able to successfully fight and drive out the Greeks. It didn't happen overnight. It was definitely a process. But they were able to, using guerrilla warfare, different tactics, they're able to drive the Greeks out. And that really was the end of Greek influence in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple, and in Judea. Now, the Greeks would still be involved in Israel. It's important to keep this in mind. When we talk about the Jews being autonomous, we're talking really in Jerusalem, and Judea, the surrounding area. But up north, down south, there are Jews everywhere. They might not be quite under the same auspices, let's say, of the Kohen Gadol. We're talking really for most of the Second Temple, it's really Judea. It's really right around Jerusalem. It's kind of a city-state. But in any event, the Maccabees, as we're told, they're from the family called the Hashmonai family, and it's not clear exactly where, but they're called the Maccabees. What is a Maccabee? It's a hammer, but according to other sources, it comes from an acronym of Mi Kamocha Be'elim Hashem, which means, and this is really the primary source.
This one's written on the grade already.
No, that's Nes Gadol Hayasham. Close. But Mi Chamocha Be'elim Hashem is part of the Jewish liturgy. It's what the Jews sing when they're at the sea. Who is like you amongst the powers, O God? And the answer is no one. And that's the story of the Hanukkah. We know the miracle, the candles, the lights for 8 days. We know the whole Hanukkah story. And it's right around now. It's about the midway point of the Second Temple era. Now, after the Greeks are driven out, so now who's in control? And the answer is it kind of reverted back to how it's always been. The family of the Kohen, it was the Kohen Gadol and his immediate family was serving not just as the head priest and running the temple service, which was a significant part of Jewish life, but it actually became very much a political position. And now the Jews had autonomy. There'd be this brief window during the Second Temple era, about 50, 60, 70 years, where the Jews had autonomy here, but it's tragic. It's an absolute story of tragedy. The Jews have autonomy. The Hashmonai family and Matisyahu, it starts off good, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the children and grandchildren of Matisyahu eventually become, they become the Kohen Gadols and the head priests, and they become the political figureheads, and they become terrible people for the most part. They become very, many of them, some of them are good. There's actually a queen in the middle who is Queen Shalamis. She was pretty good, but we're taught many of these heads of the Hashmonai family ended up becoming real monsters. So we have, for example, Yanai, who becomes king, kills many of the sages. When he attempts to become the Kohen Gadol, eventually he repents. He's a madman. We read about, it's actually during this time, there's this brief window where we have Shimon ben Shetach and Yoshua ben Gamliel. The Talmud tells us there's a brief period while things are pretty chaotic amongst the leadership. We have the first mention of kind of a Jewish education system. Talmud tells us that Shimon ben Shetach and Yeshua ben Gamliel, says Yeshua ben Gamliel, something like Zachar Latov, he should be remembered for his name should be remembered for the good, because if not for Yeshua ben Gamliel, Nishtakach Torah Yisrael, the Jewish people would have forgotten Torah. Yeshua ben Gamliel basically set up, at least, I don't know if it was the first time this ever happened, but I think the first time it's recorded, at least in Jewish sources, a real educational system where you have schools for children and they're educated, Torah, Jewish values and ethics, and we're taught during this time, this rebirth and rejuvenation. The Jewish masses are as educated as they will ever be during the Second Temple era. They are widely educated and very familiar and very observant in terms of their Judaism. That said, the leadership of the Jewish people, headed by the Hashmonai family and their descendants, they become chaotic, they become unhinged, they become murderous, they become fearful and power hungry. As I mentioned, Yanai, who becomes, he's a murderer, he's insane. The Talmud speaks very negatively of him, and he was partially from his other side of his family, he was partially an outsider. He may not have been 100% Jewish, or it wasn't so clear his lineage. The Talmud really discusses his lineage, and I think he was always unclear and always had a kind of a complex about that. Was he really accepted? Now, he probably was not allowed to be the Kohen Gadol, very likely. But again, by the Kohen Gadol was usually a political, aside from the role in the Beis Hamikdash, which he was very likely serving inappropriately. And many of the Kohen Gadol, many of the high priests would be serving inappropriately. They were not allowed to be serving. They were actually invalid. Why did they want that position? The answer is the Kohen Gadol was the president. And it was that, and it led to catastrophe. Eventually, we're taught that there would be a fight between two brothers of the Hashmonai family, Hyrcanus and Astrobulus, the Talmud tells us, and they had a power struggle. There'd be power struggles for about this 70-year period. There'd be many power struggles within the family of the Hashmonaim, and eventually Hyrcanus would, in an effort to go ahead and consolidate power and drive out his brother, he actually invited the Romans, who are the new and up and coming empire from the north. He invited the Romans to kind of tag team up along with him, so that he can consolidate power. And this is an important lesson. That's an important lesson in Jewish history. As a general rule, when Jews have internal infighting, which sadly is not so uncommon, and in a certain sense, it makes sense. You have a group. There's never going to be unanimity, and there are going to be disagreements. And disagreements aren't necessarily a problem. The question is, how are you going to resolve your differences? How are you going to figure things out? And especially when it comes to power struggles, what never has worked in the history of the Jewish people is bringing in outsiders to solve your internal conflicts. This would become the great tragedy this would be the major tragedy of the 1800s, especially the second half of the 1800s. But for in the 1800s in Europe, there would be a lot of infighting amongst the Jewish people, especially in Central Europe, and Western Europe, in Germany, but even later in Eastern Europe and other places with the Haskalah, but even in Western and Central Europe in the early 1800s, you'd have these major disagreements about the direction of the community, and they would always petition, at one point or another, one of the parties would petition the government, to try to back them up. And what sounded like a good idea, it would always end bad. It always ends bad, and that's the story. So, over here as well, the Jews go ahead and they invite the Romans in. For the most part, what's interesting, when the Romans who come in, now once they're in, they don't want to let go. What is interesting is that, similar to the Greeks, for a good chunk of time, the Romans are okay with some kind of Jewish autonomy, like a semi-autonomous relationship with the temple, with their religious life, and things kind of are what they are. The last, say, 70 years, let's say 100 years of the Second Temple era are, and this gets to another important lesson, is going to be a period that is noteworthy for its sectarianism within the Jewish people. We're taught by reading many, many different sources, and this is, within the classic Jewish sources, but even now in external sources as well, as history becomes a little clearer. Judea and the Jewish people become divided. They become divisive. They become very sectarian. So we find many groups within Jewish life all vying for influence and power. So you have these groups. If you read the New Testament, you're taught we have these groups called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group who, felt that the rabbis had drifted too far away from the literal interpretation of the Torah. You had the Baituthins. The Talmud talks about the Essenes. Not the Talmud, the New Testament talks about the Essenes. Who are they? They were some very puritanistic group, was big into ritual, going to the mikvah and things like that. These are be farther south. And then the Dead Sea, this in the Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, these were tribes of Essenes. You have, as you move forward through the Second Temple era, you have Christian Jews. Who are Christian Jews? Well, the Talmud tells us there is this fellow named Jesus. It's unclear exactly who he was, but what's certainly clear, even studying Christian sources, for the first phase of Christianity was not a religion. Christianity was a movement. It was a sectarian movement within the Jewish people. The first Christians were not Christians. They were Jewish people who followed Jesus. Jesus was a savior figure. It wasn't a new religion. There was no new religion, no new major theology that was pushed. Jesus was a sectarian figure within the Jewish people, and it created this splinter group called Jewish Christians. Now, fast forward a little bit, wouldn't be for till another 100 years later till Christianity. Well, the Jewish Christians kind of didn't work and never got off the ground. And Paul takes the message to the Gentiles, and that's where Christianity gets born as a new religion. Even then, it would take 2 more centuries. Wouldn't be till the 300s till it actually takes off. And Constantine and a little bit later. But for the early phases, first few decades, 100 years, let's say 80 years, Christianity is really a subgroup of Judaism. So you have these Sadducees, you have the Essenes, you have Christian Jews, you have Baituthines, where some other subgroup. Meanwhile, you still have Hellenists. The Hellenists were the Jews who were Hellenized, who really bought into Greek culture and are still holding on to that. And we're taught, we have all these groups. We're going to shortly see you had these group called the Sakriki. These were thugs. These were tough guys, and we're taught we have the Bar Yunai. Who are the Bar Yunai? These were I would call them nationalists. They're often called the Zealots. They were very nationalistic, and they're going to be the antagonists of the end of the story of the Second Temple, where the Zealots, these antagonists, they want to go ahead and they're interested in Jewish independence. They don't want what are the Romans doing here? We want national pride. And this is another very important lesson. We go ahead and we live in an unusual time where we have Israel, and we live in a country where you can be proud of your Judaism, and that's great. And we have pride of Jewish independence in the land of Israel. I'm the biggest Zionist out there. I got my Israeli flag pin, and I'm just as proud of a Zionist as the next guy. It needs to be understood that according to the Torah, you have to know, like the gambler, you have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. When you got to walk away and when you got to run. Judaism does not believe in nationalism as, a major, it is something in Jewish life. Of course we want to have autonomy, but the Torah actually probably puts it a couple pegs down than what many or some feel. To some, give me freedom or give me death. Give me Zion, give me Jewish nationalism or give me death. Torah doesn't agree with that. The Torah says nationalism is great when it's appropriate, but when it's not appropriate, it's better to go ahead and find an accommodation. Because what's more important than Jewish nationalism?
Jewish survival.
Well, number one, Jewish survival, but why? Why is Jewish survival more important than Jewish nationalism? I'll tell you the answer. The answer is because of the Torah. What's more important than Jewish nationalism is Torah observance. Our connection to our Torah is a more important value than our connection to our national pride. And this is something that gets lost. And this was something that these Bar Yunai, that these they lost sight of that. And they basically incited a rebellion, which is eventually going to end, it's going to end eventually in the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, it would take a little bit of time. Things calmed down. Julius Caesar is in control. Things would go back and forth. Could be a little bit of tension. Things would calm down. Eventually, one of the last Jewish during one of the viceroys, I guess, over Judea, were taught in the year about 35 before the Common Era, was a fellow named Herod. Herod, you may have heard of. Herod was a very, very complicated figure, a very significant figure in history. He is typically looked down upon as a bad figure in Jewish history, certainly by the Talmud. Herod went ahead. He marries a granddaughter of Hyrcanus, so he's kind of the last remnant of the Hashmonai family. He slaughters many people, kills out the entire Hashmonai family. He was a murderer. He was just an absolute crazy madman. He was the classic kind of guy. He, once feels bad for what he did. So he goes ahead as a way of apologizing for killing out he killed out many of the sages as a way of, many of the sages opposed his rule because he was also not really technically Jewish, or he certainly wasn't worthy. He should not have been in the position of power that he wanted to be in. And the sages were in opposition of him. And he killed out many of the Torah leaders. And then he felt bad. So he rebuilt the temple. So if you go to the Beis Hamikdash, if you go to, let's say today, to Jerusalem, and you go to the site of the second temple, you see the Kotel Hamaravi, the Western Wall. Everyone go to Israel and go to the Western. What is the Western Wall? So most people think it's the wall of the temple. It's not the wall of the temple. Before Herod, that wall, my understanding, certainly wasn't there, or certainly wasn't there the way it is today. That is actually a retaining wall. The Mount Moriah, where the temple is situated, is actually a mountain, which meant that the temple was kind of on this slanted area. It was built, the temple is actually a very small area. The actual proper temple, the Ulam, is very small. And the whole area outside of it was flat. So Herod had this great idea of building these massive retaining walls. And that's what the temple, if you go from the southern wall, if you go where the southern excavations are, all the way down to basically the end of the old city almost, that was the distance of the temple courtyard that Herod built. And he built these massive structures so that he could fill in. So the outside was this wall. And that's why if you ever go to the Kotel, you go to the Western Wall today, and they have these spots where you could see the base, how far, it was enormously tall, it was gigantic, like hundreds of feet. The idea was it was filled in on the inside. On the other side, it was filled in with dirt so that the top of the Temple Mount actually was no longer a mountain. It became flattened off. And the Kotel HaMaravi, the Western Wall that we have today, that's just a remnant of that retaining wall on the outside. The Beis Hamikdash, technically speaking, stood inside of that area, and that's completely destroyed. It's interesting. The Talmud, on the one hand, tells us that so Herod rebuilds the Beis Hamikdash. Again, the Beis Hamikdash temple wasn't destroyed. He renovates it. The Talmud says the renovation of, Herod's renovation was marvelous, was magnificent, was beautiful. However, in Judaism, we don't believe that you can go ahead and a wrong does not cancel out a right, or the other way around. Right does not cancel out a wrong. We believe in tshuva and repentance. Herod, the way it seems, he didn't repent. He was a murderer. He was a bad person. He wanted to, it's like Al Capone, I'll be a murderer, gangster, and I'll take care of the poor also. That doesn't take care of the bad that you've done. You can repent and change your ways. We evolve, but don't think that you can give charity and now it's okay for you to continue doing the bad things that you've done. And that's really why I think in the Talmud and Jewish history, Herod is frowned upon as not a righteous man. Eventually, beginning of the year, we're taught the destruction of the Second Temple era, there were a few years of the temple, which is eventually destroyed, the year 70 of the Common Era, 68 of the Common Era, depending on how you calculate. The sectarian clashes within Judaism really provokes the Romans. The Romans eventually, the Jews engage in a revolt, a civil war. The Jews actually find themselves in Jerusalem besieged. But we're taught that they have enough material, they have enough property to go ahead and really survive that siege. It's these Bar Yunai, these zealots, we are taught, the Talmud tells us tragically, they go ahead and they burn the Jewish supplies. They're Jews. They burn their own food to force the rest of the Jews inside of Jerusalem to fight. Because the Jews were like, oh, we're just going to wait this thing out. We have enough food, enough supplies, enough store. We'll be good for years. But they didn't want that. They wanted to fight. And it was a terrible tragedy. These Bar Yunai are really credited with the destruction of the Second Temple era. And we know the Romans come in and Titus comes in and destroys the Beis Hamikdash. And it's a terrible story. And we know it's one of the great tragedies. And, the Jews are exiled, millions of Jews, or Josephus says over a million, Josephus, who's an important point, he's a Jewish person who collaborates with the Romans, becomes a historian. A lot of our historical record comes through Josephus Flavius. And he writes, I think he says 1.2 million Jews were killed at this time. It was one of the darkest moments in Jewish history. There's a really very important point, and one of the most important stories I think in the Talmud. I find this story, it's so important. We talk about all these splintered groups: Pharisees, Sadducees, Jewish Christians, Essenes, Baithusians, Hellenists. Who made it? Who survived? Which Jews won? What's that? The Pharisees. The Sadducees are the Sadducean. Which group survived? The Pharisees. What is a Pharisee? So the Pharisee is it's a Josephus word. It's the Prushim. Who are the Prushim? Prushim means the separatists. Who are the Prushim? The Prushim were the people who followed rabbinic Judaism, who sort of looked at what was happening during these last few decades of the Second Temple era, and they see the Jews have all these strange ideologies and beliefs and this and that, and they said, we're separating from you guys. You're crazy. And they separated and they followed Torah Judaism. All of these other groups faded away. And this is an important lesson. Throughout Jewish history, there have been many, many, many splintered groups throughout the millennia. Going back literally to the times of Moses, we have splintered groups, Korach. And I always say there are always two things that are common or that recur with splinter groups. Number one, a splinter group that starts altering the Torah. Usually that's what happens. And number two, they don't survive. They might be the dominant group. They might be the majority. They won't survive. You give it a century, 2 centuries, they'll fade away. The only thing that survives Jewish history is the Torah. That's not an opinion. That's an objective statement of analysis of Jewish history. The only thing that survives generationally in Judaism is the Torah and those who cling to it. The Talmud tells us such an important story. Talmud tells us a story. One of the great leaders of Jewish people at this time is a great figure found in the Mishnah. His name is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan tells us this whole story. He's in Jerusalem and he's snuck out. Let me get the exact Gemara. Let's see, where is it? Talmud tells us he sneaks out of Jerusalem, right? He pretends to be a corpse. They pretend to be dead. They sneak him out. And he has a meeting with Vespasian. Who's Vespasian? At the time, Vespasian was the kind of the main general on the siege of Jerusalem. And Talmud says that, I want to get the actual passage of the Talmud. It's so important. No, I don't have it here on my sources. I'll guess it as best as I can. Rabbi Yochanan meets Vespasian, and he basically he introduces himself and he shows dignity. He calls him king. He calls him the king. And Vespasian, who's the general, tells Rabbi Yochanan, I should kill you for 2 reasons. Number one, I'm not the king. So you calling me the king is insubordination. That's a rebellion. You're chayiv misa. I should kill you for, inciting rebellion. And number 2, if I am the king, how come you didn't come earlier? Where were you yesterday? Where have you been all these years? So Rabbi Yochanan says, first of all, you should know we have a tradition, anyone who's going to be successful in a siege against Jerusalem, he had a tradition, you must be a king. And second of all, I would have gotten out here, but there was a siege and there was conflict. I got here as soon as I could. Talmud says immediately, there's a knock on the door, obviously paraphrasing, knock on the door, and there's a messenger who came from Rome who said, by the way, the Caesar has died, and Vespasian, they've appointed you to the king as the next Caesar. You're the next guy. And Vespasian is blown away. This Rabbi Yochanan is, he's got obviously a divine, a divine person. And Vespasian basically says He's like, the genie in the bottle. He says, I'll give you 3 wishes. So let's see if I can remember. One of them, he says, asks to cure Rabbi Tzadok, who was one of the sages who's very ill, so send for a physician to cure him. So he did that. I don't remember what the second one was, but the third, this is really the point I wanted to get to. What does Rabbi Yochanan go ahead and ask? It's the Gemara in Nezikin, in Hanizakin, in Gittins. I must have it here. Oh, it's so worthwhile. So he says, what does Rabbi Yochanan say? These are of the most important words in the entire Talmud. He says, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha. Give me Yavne and its wise men. What was Yavne v'chachameha? Jerusalem was in siege. Jerusalem was in the last years of before the destruction. What's interesting is, where were the Pharisees? Where were all the rabbis? Where was Torah? How did they make it through the Churban Bayis? You know what the answer is? They were long gone. They had seen the insanity that was in Jerusalem. They were not rooting for Jerusalem to the temple, even when things were at this low point in Jewish history. They were hoping that the Beis HaMikdash would survive and somehow the situation would resolve itself. But they had left. They didn't want, like, this national struggle. They're not interested. They were interested in what? Preserving the Torah. Because they understood you can have a destroyed Beis HaMikdash. You can have Jews in exile. You can have Jews scattered across the face of the earth. We can survive. You take the Torah away from the Judaism, we're done. They were in Yavne. They had fled to the coast, the city of Yavne. And that's where the Sanhedrin, that's where the Beis Hagadol, that's where the main court, that's where Torah was centralized, was in Yavne. And Rabbi Yochanan, when Vespasian says, what do you want? He says, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha. Rabbi Yochanan is thinking, what's going through Rabbi Yochanan's mind? He's thinking about the future very survival of the Jewish people. And he realizes, you know what I need? You know what we all need for Judaism to survive? Through the greatest catastrophe? The answer is, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha. Give me Yavne, give me Torah. The Talmud says, interesting, I don't think the Talmud's, the way I understand it, the Talmud's not really being critical. The Talmud says, during moments of great crisis and tragedy in the Jewish people, the eyes, as it were, of our leaders are blinded. Talmud says, really, Rabbi Yochanan could have asked and should have asked the Vespasian to spare the temple. Don't destroy the Beis HaMikdash, just leave us alone. And the implication is, that Vespasian would have said, fine. But it was divine interference of sorts. Rabbi Yochanan didn't have the clarity to go ahead and ask for that. Why did Rabbi Yochanan not ask for that? What was going through Rabbi Yochanan? I think what was happening is Rabbi Yochanan wasn't so sure that would work. And he felt it's more important. I don't know, Beis HaMikdash, maybe not. You know what's more important? Tein li Yavne v'chachameha. And it's a remarkable thing. Moving forward, the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. And it's a disaster. And it's a nightmare for the Jewish people. But that passage, that request, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha, that's why we're here today. Because Rabbi Yochanan had the recognition and the wisdom to recognize that for Judaism to survive generationally, for Judaism to flourish, we need the Torah. Shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews are still living in the land of Israel. We know story there. The Jews are going to remain in the land of Israel for another 2 centuries. If the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, let's say the year 70, the Romans are still there. Jerusalem is in ruins, but Judaism is still flourishing, is not the right word. Judaism is still focused in Israel, mainly more on the coast and up north. And the Jewish communities and Torah scholarship flourish. It's during these times, during ballpark the year 170, where one of the great leaders, great figures in Jewish history emerges onto the scene. His name is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. Who is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi? Who's Rabbi Yehuda the Prince? He was kind of he was the really a remarkable and unusual figure in Jewish history. If you've been to our From Sinai to You class, we talk about the role of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Who was he? He was, number one, the political figurehead at this point in an unofficial capacity. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, that's over with. The Beis HaMikdash is destroyed in the year 70. After that, the Jewish community is really, it's scattered. It's disorganized. So you don't have necessarily official leadership. You have unofficial people who are figurehead lead, not just figureheads, but they're kind of the leaders of the community. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi serves that role. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince serves that role. We're also taught that he was a very wealthy and influential man. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we are taught that he was the leading scholar, the leading Torah sage of the time. That's very unusual in Jewish history, that both the most influential political person, the most financially influential person, and the most influential person on a Torah level is all one and the same. And he becomes a really, really remarkable person, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. It's during this time that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, with his great foresight, Rambam tells us, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he sees the temple has been destroyed about 75 years before. He sees the situation is not improving in Israel. The Romans are not letting up. Their interference with Jewish life is increasing. Rambam says the tsaros hochos ubos, something like that. The calamities, the difficulties are not getting any better. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi makes a really important decision. He decides for the first time in Jewish history, he's going to codify the oral tradition of the Torah. So we've talked about in many classes, the Torah, God gives us the Torah at Sinai. And we have the text of the Torah, the Chumash. You ever look in a Torah scroll, we have the text and we believe it's the Torah, it's our very life. But we know in the foundation of Judaism is, aside from the text of the Torah, there is an oral tradition of the Torah that God gave us at Sinai to sort of explain what the whole Torah was all about. That was passed on generationally, one generation to another. It was never codified. So it was never, was it written down? Rambam says people took notes, but nothing was ever published. Well, first of all, you didn't have printing presses. But aside from that, I would use the word, nothing was codified. That this is the official, rule book or playbook for the Jewish code of law or anything like that. Rabbi Yehuda, and that system worked. Everything was just kind of, you had these central bodies, you had these Beis Din HaGadols, you had these central courts that would legislate, they would go ahead and clarify any misunderstandings. And it was during the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, however, where he sort of saw that Judaism, it's not going to work anymore. The temple has been destroyed. The Jewish people are scattered in Israel. The truth of the matter is, after the year 68, 70 of the Common Era, after the destruction of Jerusalem, many of the Jews are exiled. Many Jews go down to Egypt. Most Jews go where? To Babylonia. Eventually, that's where they will make it, back to Babylonia, where there had always been a Jewish community. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi sees that the Jewish people are getting more and more scattered, and they're suffering more and more. So he goes ahead and he decides he's going to codify some of the great teachings and rulings of the last, let's say, 2 centuries of Jewish history, and they're codified in the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah? It's 64 books that are organized into 6 major sections. The 6 sections deal with different areas of Jewish life, and the Mishnah are very quick issues of rulings of Jewish law. Featured in the Mishnah, we have some of the great leaders of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's time, of Rabbi Yehuda the Prince's his time, and the generation or 2 or 3 before him just kind of makes sense. Like to be able to cite, Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Akiva. These are people who are, I would call, some of them were contemporaries of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Most of them were a generation before, 2 generations before, and maybe even 3, maybe even 4 generations before, and they're codified in the Mishnah. Next class that we have, we're going to talk, so we now started Talmudic Times. In our next class, we're going to have to call it here, the hour is late. We'll start talking about what the Mishnah is, what the Talmud is, and then what happened after the Talmud to get us to the times of, let's say, through the beginning of the Middle Ages, what happened for the next, let's say, almost 1,000 years of Jewish history, what happened to Judaism after, this major epoch. But it should be seen in Jewish life, the year, we'll call it 175, it's hard to know exactly, 70, 190, 200, the codification of the Mishnah being the first work of Judaism that's actually put down to writing, the first codification of anything, of any sort. It's a massive epoch. And we're going to see next time, please God, what happened. Now, scheduling note, I'm not here next week. So the next time we meet is going to be in 2 weeks. So I'll send everyone, please God, an email. Just to remind everyone, I hope to remember. If I don't remember, please remind everyone, next week we're not going to meet, but please God, in 2 weeks, we'll pick it up with kind of what happened after the Mishnah, what were its goals, and what's the Talmud, and then the role of the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. July 6th sounds right.
How many generations do you have?
So Rambam tells us from Moses to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is 40 generations. Now, if you try to get it if Moses is in the year 2448 and from creation, which is, I always lose my conversion, from the secular calendar to the Jewish calendar. What's that?
It was about 1400
BC, something like that. Oh, what did I write on there?
Yeah, 1312.
That's Moses at Sinai.
Yes.
1312 BC. That sounds about right. And then the Mishnah is the year. It's also not so clear. Let's say the year 170 of the Common Era. The destruction of the temple is the year 70 of the Common Era, and that's our chronology. Any other thoughts, questions before we call it a day? So that's the story. So please God, we'll pick it up in 2 weeks with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi about the year 170 of the Common Era.
So we have his scholars and students that follow that.
So we'll see. His students, they're going to be significant people in Jewish history, and we'll please God talk about that next time. But yeah.
Tell me the completion of the Talmud.
Okay, so we'll talk about that next time. It's a little bit more ambiguous, but time-wise, we'll call that the year 440, 450. But we'll talk about that, please God, next week when we talk about what the role of the Talmud is and who are those figures. We'll get that next week. So that's the story. Thank you all for coming, and we will wish you all a good night. I'm not